All right, here I am joined by Mike Ryan, who is a meteorologist with the National Weather Service, and we're going to be talking about the new climate data that has been updated. And before we get and dive into the meat and potatoes here of all of the changes, I wanted to kind of go back and give everybody a view of climate data in general and why we use it and why we take a look at it. When we're on television and we're giving an almanac and talking about normal highs or number of 90-degree days that we normally see, why is that so important, and how do we look at that and get those numbers?
Well, it's important, first of all, Tara, because it helps give us a snapshot of how things are changing over time. The Weather Service has always utilized 30-year normals. That gives a nice range of time to get an idea of certain trends, whether it be temperature, precipitation, snowfall, any of those things, how many 90-degree days we have in a given year. And every 10 years, we basically drop off the earliest 10 years and we bring in the newest 10 years. So for this recent update that just came online here earlier this month, we brought in the 2010s and we dropped the 1980s. And we can look at the previous blocks of 30 years to see how things have changed. And it helps give us a feel for just some of the trends that we see. Are they kind of more defined to more recent trends, or does it have to do with various things in the past? One example I'll give real quick. The previous one we did 10 years ago took us from 1971 to 2000 to 1981, 2010. And so we lost the 1970s, which many of longtime Hoosiers will remember involved a lot of very brutal winters. And we saw, in fact, when we lost those 1970s winters, it actually led to some of the snowfall averages dropping a little bit. And that's just one example I give there. So
why do we use a 30-year? I mean, is there a specific reason why it's only 30 years? I mean, we have records dating all the way back to the 1880s, but we want to get that current climate snapshot, right?
Right. And that's basically, what the 30-year normal does. That's something that comes down from the World Meteorological Organization. That's not to say that you can look at a longer range of time to determine certain trends, but the feeling is that basically a 30-year period is a long enough period of time to provide a really basic snapshot in various parts of the country. And so that's something we've used as, I think, going well back into the 20th century as kind of a time frame that's acceptable.
Yeah. So this new 30-year climate period, you mentioned we've dropped the 1980s and we've started from 1991 and we're all the way up to 2020, right?
Yeah.
So
yep.
How have things changed a little bit since dropping off the 80s or dropping off the 90s dropping off the 80s and adding the 90s and 2020s?
Well, I'll tell you, here locally in central Indiana, some trends that I think we kind of anticipated. Interesting thing, we noticed that average temperatures rose. We were kind of anticipating that. When you break it down to monthly, one interesting aspect, and I don't really have a good answer for this as to why, every month saw temperatures warm in Indianapolis, for example, on average, except November. I don't know why that was. But on average, the rises were about a half degree to maybe as much as 1 degree. The biggest jump we saw, which we thought was really interesting, was in December with an almost 2-degree rise. And interestingly, when you go back and look, the snowfall totals dropped in December as well. They dropped a little bit for the entire season by about a ½ inch or so. But it was more noticeable in the late fall and into the early winter, which again may be just showing that if you take away the winter, for example, the one we had in 2013, 2014 that was brutally cold and had all the snow, it seems to me, just thinking back over recent years, that it takes us a while to get going into the core of the winter weather, that it's typically after the new year in January and February. And maybe that's what some of this data is spelling out for us.
I noticed too that I noticed the temperatures, and I was a little surprised too. Some of those temperatures jumping, um, I think it was 1.7 degrees in
That
the.
was the December one. Yeah, that was quite a jump. I was a little surprised to see that too. And again, I wonder if, and this is something that I think we're going to try and research in the future,
Mhm.
but I wonder if going back into the 1980s, we saw a lot of colder Decembers. I think back, and this is going back to when I was a kid, December 83 was brutally cold. December 89 was brutally cold. Um, could that have had at least an impact maybe in magnifying that rise as much as it was? I don't know. That's something that we would need to look at, but it's certainly plausible.
I also saw a bit of an increase in precipitation, especially
Mm-hmm.
with rainfall and yearly up the normal from 1981 to 2010 to 1991 to 2020 went up more than an inch. I thought
It
that
did.
was a
Now,
little interesting too.
yeah, it did, but it's interesting also. I'll throw this caveat out. When you look at some of the other climate sites across central Indiana, and I'm talking about locations like Lafayette, Terre Haute, Bloomington, Muncie, even Eagle Creek and Shelbyville, um, the precipitation adjustments were a lot more variable. You actually had a couple of stations that dropped
Oh,
average precipitation totals. Um, and that some of that may just be to the nature of, especially when you get into the warmer season, how much more localized heavier rainfall can be. And we're starting to see a little bit more of that. The other thing I thought was interesting, referencing what you mentioned, um, is our warning coordination meteorologist, Sam Lashley, began a research project a number of years ago when he was up at the Northern Indiana office, looking at excessive rainfall rates and frequency of at a number of locations across the state. And what he referenced with that is, okay, how many times are we seeing more than 2 inches in a certain event, or 3 inches, or even 5 inches? And we found that there's been a gradual rise in those type of events over the recent 10, 20, 30 years. We're seeing that jump up a little bit. And so some of this data may be supporting that in a way, I think, with the increase. I think it's also safe to say that I anticipated we were going to see a shift to, on average, a little wetter, and that's what we're seeing annually. Now, if you break it down by month or season,
mhm.
it's not quite as noticeable. It's more noisy, but annually, yes, we're back up a little bit.
Yeah, I've noticed a monthly. I think what did I have here? 8 of 12 months saw an increase in precipitation, but some of those months were only maybe 0.02 or something like that. They were
Right.
pretty light. Yeah.
And I
So,
think what I saw, and I'm going back to the notes we had, um, we saw the greatest increases in precipitation in January, April, and June.
mhm.
And by byproduct, May, November, and December were drier. They tended to be so that just may be again showcasing that we're seeing subtle variations in when we see the most excessive or greatest frequency for most excessive rainfall.
Mhm.
So for instance, like what I was talking about going back to December, maybe we're seeing less snowfall, less precipitation in the late fall and early winter, and it's focusing more, let's say, in January.
Right.
And that might be what's going on here and leading to some of the variations. It's really kind of fascinating to just kind of see the differences.
Yeah. Um, let's talk a little bit about snowfall because I think you alluded to this a little bit. There was a decrease of snow in December, but an increase of snow for March. And
Yes.
overall, our seasonal snowfall has dropped almost about a half an inch, 0.4 inches.
Yeah.
Was that a little bit of a surprise, or is that something that look? I mean, December with the warmer temperatures, that kind of makes sense a little bit, right?
Yeah. I personally was not that surprised. I was kind of expecting we'd see a bit of a drop just because, I think as many of your viewers and listeners will probably note, we have not really seen very active snowfall seasons, it seems like recently. We did a little better this year, but you have to go back to that 2013, 2014 winter where we had over 50 inches of snow. Other than that, I think with the exception of this year, we haven't been above like 22 or 23 inches for the year.
Right.
So I kind of was anticipating that. I also was not surprised to see the rise in March. And the reason for that is, again, in recent years, it seems like we're seeing snowfalls a little later into the early spring. We saw it just a couple of weeks ago with that snowfall in April.
Yeah.
And I think back to, I think it was 2018, we had a big snowfall in late March. And that same year, I think we had our heaviest snow ever on Easter.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it may just mean that snow season is shifting ever so subtly. And that's what's leading to some of those differences in the numbers we're seeing.
I also wanted to talk to you a little bit, something that Marcus Bailey and I were chatting about a little bit, were the rise in minimum temperatures. So low temperatures at night, early in the morning, seem to be going up a little bit. And that was kind of really interesting to me too. I saw 11 of 12 months, the minimum temperatures increased anywhere from minimal 0.2 degrees to almost 2 degrees. I think, was that in
Yeah.
December too? Yeah, the minimum
That,
1.8.
yeah.
Was that something else that you thought was a little interesting too, or?
Thought it was interesting. I, again, was expecting that, was maybe a little bit intrigued at the fact that some of those rises were as big as they were. I will say, going back, because I've been involved in climate data here with the Weather Service for most of my career, and that goes back to the late 90s. So this is the third iteration of climate normal changes I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
And that rise in nighttime lows has shown up in each of the previous two. Okay. And what's interesting is the largest monthly rises in temperatures that we saw in Indianapolis coincided with pretty robust rises in overnight lows in those months. The other thing I think is interesting is we noticed it was most prevalent in the wintertime. That's also something that's shown up in previous changes in the normals. I think there are a couple of factors in play. Obviously, I think just a natural component of climate change is in play with that. But you also wonder, if there's not some component, at least here with Indianapolis as an example, of the urbanization, mm-hmm. especially out around the airport, keeping those temperatures at night a little bit warmer. Also, in the wintertime, could it be a situation where we have a night with a northerly or northeasterly wind, which would bring warmer modified air that's over the city out to the southwest across the airport and keep the temperature up a little bit? Mm-hmm. I think those are all a couple of components that are likely in play.
Okay.
But that trend is really interesting with the nighttime lows. We've seen it. It shows up in all the seasons, but it really shows up in the wintertime. And it may also mean we're just not getting as cold in general at night anymore in the wintertime. I mean, the last few years, we haven't had that many nights that get below zero. They happen every now and then, but mm-hmm. Again, there may just be a subtle shift in the climate there for our area.
And let's talk a little bit real quick about how we're talking about climate normals. Like, we can still have extremes. I mean, we had frost advisories. Right. We just had a frost advisory after Mother's Day, when, of course, that's the time when you can normally plant, right? I had to bring my hanging basket inside. So talk a little bit about that and let people know that, again, this is a normal, and we could still see those swings that go up and down.
Absolutely, Tara. I mean, when we talk about climate change, I think there's a misconception that it's, everybody's warming, everybody's doing this, and that's not exactly it. The climate and how it changes is different in every part of the country. It's different depending on the landscape, the ground cover, urbanization and things like that. There are a lot of factors that come into play with that. With regards to this, I mean, yes, we can still see a lot of different extremes, and we've seen that. One thing that we've noticed in trends, and I'll give you an example for this. I think a lot of people think, it's going to just be wetter. This is saying 1 inch wetter, reaching that normal on this most recent iteration of the normals. Well, we may have periods of the year that are more excessively wetter, but we may also have periods of the year that are more excessively drier and more susceptible to drought. Those extremes may be greater. And so that variation is going to continue depending on where you are. And just for an example, the last couple of years, I think, especially 2019, I think even 2018, we had very, very wet springs and early summers. And then everything flipped midsummer and we went into very, very dry extended periods in the later summer and fall. And that would tend to average it out. But just because we're saying that on average, the years should be wetter than normal doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to have periods where it's drier than normal or where it's warmer or colder than normal. Those extremes are still going to be there.
Gotcha. Is there anything that you, looking at this new climate data for the new 30-year, that stuck out to you, or have we covered everything everything that stuck out to me, but I mean, for you, is there anything that either stuck out that you saw surprising or that you thought maybe would change and didn't change, or anything like that?
I think the biggest things we definitely hit on, maybe for me, some of the things that were a little bit more interesting and intriguing were the extent of some of the rises or changes in some cases. And we loosely talked about that, I think, especially with monthly average temperature, because when we went out to some of the surrounding climate sites, we saw some noticeable jumps in some of the average temperatures. And those locations have a shorter climate period of record than here in Indianapolis. But again, when you're talking about a 30-year normal, that shouldn't necessarily impact as much. So again, does it come back into play with, things building out in places like, let's say, Muncie, as that continues to build out, or Lafayette, things like that. It's a lot of interesting trends, some things that we may not be able to explicitly explain. But, in terms of, I was expecting to see temperatures on average warm over an annual period and precipitation rise. And that just seems to be the trend we've been following, not just over the last 10 years, but over the last 20 or 30 years. And I think we're going to see that trend continue as we go into this new normal period.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to ask you real quick, I think you've already done this a little bit, but moving into the spring season and summer, do we have an outlook or a forecast on what we may anticipate?
Well, sure. I'll tell you, and we can tell your viewers and listeners, you will remember this from when you sat in on our spring partner meeting a month or two ago. I was well on board with the idea of an active severe weather season up here into the Ohio Valley, because we were coming out of a La Nina period that typically promotes a more active storm track through the Ohio Valley into the spring. And lo and behold, it just hasn't happened. The focus has been further south in the Tennessee Valley, and actually even recently it's been well down in the south, in Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas. Now, that's not to say we won't get into that in the coming weeks. I mean, it certainly appears that full-blown spring is well in our crosshairs now. But I still think we could see an active period maybe through June before we settle into summer. I still think the potential is there for a warmer than normal summer. We've been dry since the winter time, really since back in the fall. Some of the recent rains have helped, but it's going to be interesting to see where things trend going into June. If things start to dry out, that could lead us more towards kind of a hotter, drier summer as we go later into, July and August, and then on into the fall. So that's kind of the general thought right now. The fact we haven't really had any severe weather is really kind of shocking, and I think we're probably due to see a period here at some point, maybe over the next 6 to 8 weeks or so.
Well, as I am just about 7 months pregnant and going to be 9 months pregnant in the middle of summer, not really looking forward to your hotter than normal forecast. Yee.
Keep the AC running, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, plenty of water and staying hydrated. Well, Mike, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your outlook heading into the spring and summer season, and also what, and the kind of going over and explaining what this new 30-year normal means for us here in Indianapolis. So thank you so much for all of your hard work, and we appreciate it.
You bet, Tara. My pleasure, and it's always good to catch up with you.